goodness, this is the first show of the year. This is a huge year. This is 2026, which also means it's the 60th anniversary of Star Trek. And who better to have on the show, in my opinion, for this day is a wonderful person whose hands are all over Star Trek. We're going to get to him in a moment. As you know, I'm Michael Dismuke. You can look at my work on michaeldismuke.com. I'm a freelance writer for Star Trek Adventures RPG, but also a freelance writer for Star Trek fiction, amongst other things that you'll be hearing coming in later in the year. And this show has never been a show, ever been a show, will never be a show without Jim Johnson.
Hey everybody, Jim Johnson. You know me. I'm the project manager for Star Trek Adventures and Fallout at Ridiculous Entertainment. I'm a Star Trek writer, fiction writer, science fiction, fantasy mostly, a bunch of other stuff coming down the road. And very excited to be here, co-host on this show. Gosh, 5 years now, Michael. I lost track. I don't care. I mean, I do care, but 5 years, man, crazy. And we're still talking about Star Trek. And there's always more Star Trek to talk about. And now that it's 2026, like imminently we have a new TV series about to hit with Starfleet Academy, and I don't know about you, but I'm really excited because I love me
Very.
some new Star Trek, and what I've seen of the previews so far has me really amped up for it. So I can't wait to see not just the show itself, but I can't wait to see what kind of fiction and comic books and gaming stuff and like other things that might come out in support of Starfleet Academy. But
Well, people may have noticed our new tagline too if they saw the visual. If not on if they're listening on a podcast, we're now infinite stories and infinite combinations because we kind of got so big, we've blown up to include beyond RPG all kinds of literature, which is, of course, why I felt we had to herald on our very first episode of 2026 with this fantastic guest. You want to introduce him, Jim?
yeah, you bet. No stranger to the show, and no stranger to us. I've known him for long time. Gosh, it's got to be 20 plus years now, Scott. Hard to believe, but hard to imagine. And never thought we'd be here now when we were first meeting for Strange New Worlds 7, right? So Scott Pearson is here as our guest tonight. So Scott, introduce yourself, please.
Hey there, I'm Scott Pearson. I'm very excited to be here in the 60th anniversary year of Star Trek. And I don't know, how much do you want me to go into my Star Trek introduction right now?
I actually want you to go into a little bit, Scott, because I know 2025 was a kind of a big year for you. You kind of expanded your work and involvement in the Star Trek, franchise. So can you talk to us about what you do? If people have never met you before, let's pretend. Who are you? What do you do? How are your fingers in Star Trek?
Well, I was the copy editor, the freelance copy editor of the Star Trek novels from Simon and Schuster for 10 years. Uh, Earlier this year, I became the developmental editor on the Star Trek line. Late the year before, I became the proofreader on the Star Trek line of comic books from IDW, and I also edit and occasionally write for the Star Trek Adventures role-playing game. So I've got three different formats in print of Star Trek that I work on.
That's super cool, Scott. And for our listeners and our viewers who don't know the ins and outs of the editing and publishing world, can you talk very briefly about the difference between a copy editor at Simon and Schuster, copy editing the books, and your new role now is the developmental editor of the books? How are those two roles different?
Sure, a copy editor is the last step before the proofreader. You come in late in the game, the manuscript has been finished, it's been polished by the editors in-house, it's been reviewed by the people at CBS Paramount. Everyone is happy with the manuscript. The copy editor comes in, tries to catch any and all little mistakes that might have slipped through the cracks beforehand, and then after that, it still goes to a proofreader to once again try to find any little fiddly bits that have gone wrong. The developmental editor is with the author from the beginning. You work with the author to develop their pitch. And when you're working with an IP like Star Trek, I mentioned CBS Paramount, it has to be approved by them at a couple steps along the way. So that pitch has to be approved. Sometimes it has to be approved twice because sometimes if it's a tie-in to one of the new series, it has to be approved by Secret Hideout, and that would be Kirsten Beyer working for Secret Hideout, and be okay paid by CBS Paramount. And you do that for the pitch, the outline, and then eventually the manuscript. And as you're kicking ideas back and forth at the author, you can really help them shape the manuscript in a way that you hope will ease its path through all the layers of of getting that stamp of approval that you want. Um, and so copy editor almost at the end, developmental editor can be there right from the beginning.
So then is your role as the developmental editor, is that effectively an acquisitions editor? Are you going out to writers and saying, "Hey, we should write a book about X," and then work with them on the pitch and the outline? Or is there another body that's saying, "Hey, Scott, we need 5 books this year. Go find me 5 writers and make me 5 pitches."
Well, uh, that can be the role. Um, Unfortunately, due to the circumstances under which I got my job, which was the tragic and unexpected passing of Margaret Clark, who had worked on the novels for decades and worked on the comic book line, I believe, at Marvel before that, uh, I inherited a number of projects that were already going along. And so there's only one of the books that I've worked with the author from the beginning.
Mhm.
And if my role as developmental editor continues, because when I was brought on, it was specifically like we need someone to take care of the 25-26 schedule.
Mhm.
And with any luck, my role will continue past the 26 schedule into
Mhm.
27. And at that point, then yes, I could have the chance to approach authors and work with the people in-house at Simon and Schuster to bring people in and see what kind of books we want to do.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's exciting. I mean, I understand that the circumstances are unfortunate and tragic, but I mean, what a cool opportunity as you move on, right? And then tie into your comic book work now that you're doing a lot of copy editing for IDW and presumably our friend Heather Rantos, right?
Yes, well, I'm just doing proofreading on the comic books,
Mhm.
and so I'm coming in right at the end. And yeah, and that really happened. Well, it happened for two reasons. One being my Star Trek credentials, and the other being that I had a former coworker who knows I'm a huge Star Trek geek and who had done some work with Heather at IDW. And so when my former coworker Madeline heard that they were looking for a new proofreader, she got in touch with me and said, "Hey, you should get this job. Let me put you in touch with Heather." And so I got in touch with Heather and said, I have to admit, I've never worked in the comic book field before, but my Star Trek credentials are, you know, deep and wide. And
That's yeah. That's a great
so they,
segue. Again, why don't we talk about that a little bit? I'd love to segue that. Jim and I, we consistently talk in this show about developing your own body of work. You have your own body of work, you have your own novels, as Jim mentioned. But take us back to your first experience, again, working with Star Trek. And then I'm going to be excited to make sure we covered during this podcast about your predictions about the future 60 years of Star Trek. But first, introduce us. What was your stepping stone into Star Trek?
my stepping stone into professional Star Trek was like Jim. I was a winner in the Strange New Worlds short story contest way back in the day, like I think 2004 and 2006 were the years that I got published. And so, that was run as a contest. People who didn't have, uh, you could only have up to three professional sales, and you were still eligible to enter this contest because it was meant to be for people just starting out. And so I was able to get in there a couple of years. And then after that, Marco Palmieri invited me to pitch for the Star Trek Next Generation 20th Anniversary Anthology, and I got a story in there. And then he asked me to pitch for the Myriad Universes 3 anthology, and so then I got a novella in there. And then eventually I was asked to pitch stories by Margaret Clark for an ebook exclusive when they were experimenting with putting out stories just as ebooks, no print version. And so I did one ebook exclusive, the More Things Change, which was a TOS story set after the events of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And then it wasn't long after that came out that Simon and Schuster was looking for a new copy editor, and they wanted to find someone who was familiar with the franchise and who had experience as a copy editor. And lucky for me, even though a couple years before Marco had been laid off during troubling times at Simon and Schuster and across the publishing industry at large, uh, one of the people that was still working at Simon and Schuster got in touch with Marco and said, "Hey, do you know anyone that would be good for this job?" And he said, "Well, Scott Pearson has written for us, and he's a freelance copy editor. You should get in touch with him." And so that was how I got the Star Trek novel copy editing job 10 years ago.
Very nice.
And yeah, and so then when Margaret passed away unexpectedly and they needed someone to step in quickly, they had me right there, someone who'd been working on the books for 10 years.
Incredible. For those of you who are
And
listening on the podcast right now, you can't see Scott's background. Scott's background is the reason why I don't even try to collect all the novels in hard print because I know I can never have his collection. So I just get them on Kindle, stuff like that. So I just want to, I'm saying that to remark about Scott, how well studied you are on the franchise. You did the work and you earned the spot. So
I've got the library here that I often dive into when I'm working on a novel or something for Star Trek Adventures or reading the comic books. I can go and look things up and double check. What was that planet called? What quadrant is it in? I look these things up.
Yeah. And I'll just say, Michael, you'll appreciate this because I know you recently had that short story published in one of the last issues of Star Trek Explorer. But you never forget your first professional sale, much less your first professional Star Trek sale. So Scott, there it is, Star Trek Seven,
There it is.
Seven. This blue cover, man, this thing popped off the shelf at me when we first saw it, right? And it's got a special place in my heart. And it's just funny. You signed it for me at shore leave many moons ago, and I had actually forgotten that we both wrote Death of Kirk stories for that one, and Dean, accepted both of them and published them because they were very different perspectives, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that was good times. So Scott, I was sitting here thinking, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, and I was like, I don't think there is anybody on this planet who has touched the fiction side, the comic books, and the RPG. I think you may have that singular honor, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk just a little bit about how how do you approach the three mediums, given that they're similar, right? But different, right? Because you got very different ways of telling stories in each of them, or at least, if not telling stories, presenting information. So, like, how do you shift your brain, your writing and editorial brain, from copy editing this to proofreading this to copy editing that, like, comic books, RPGs, and fiction.
It can be a little bit of a challenge. These last several months, when I've been working as a developmental editor on the novel line, there are times that I have to remind myself, you're not just copy editing now. I don't have to focus on on the smaller details because there are two other people coming after me to look at those. So sometimes I can, say, you know what, I'm not going to worry about the semicolons as much. I have to look at the bigger picture. I have to figure out, wait a minute, this character, that, chapter, this, and connect those dots, make sure everything comes together. Uh, and then, yeah, it gets a little bit different than on Star Trek Adventures. I mean, I'm back to doing more general copy editing there. For a while, I was only doing sort of the canon review, and so I only had to just be looking at the little fiddly details that drive, hardcore Star Trek fans nuts. And now I have to pay more attention to, the grammar and all that sort of stuff. And so that's a shift. And then starting in the comic books, I'm just doing the proofreading, but I also had to learn the language of comic books. And, there are a lot more differences between prose fiction and comic books than you might realize uh, until you kind of start really having to look at it professionally. Another thing that was a great advantage for me was I mentioned earlier my former coworker Madeline, who had got me in touch with Heather about the proofreading job. Before the proofreading job uh, came along, she happened to hire me as a freelance copy editor to copy edit her self-published book that is a style guide for comic book proofreaders. Because when she started working in the comic book industry, coming there from regular prose, fiction, and nonfiction, she was kept asking people at IDW or DC or Marvel, "Where's your style guide?" Because when you come from the regular prose field, you're used to, you've got the Chicago Manual of Style, particularly if you're working in fiction. That's what almost every publisher uses. And so she wanted that style guide, and they were all like, well, we don't have one. There wasn't a universal style guide for the comic book industry. And so she thought, you know what? I'm going to write one. And it is a great overview of little fiddly things in comic books that even though I've read comic books for decades, there are little things that I never noticed in comic book style, like when a capital I has the crossbars and when it doesn't.
Okay, tell us
And
this. Now you got to give us a couple of these just to keep our eyes sharp.
well, basically, well, now I'm going to embarrass myself because now I'm like, wait a minute, what is it? It's the kind of
You don't
thing
have
that
to
I,
focus on that, but I am curious. I am curious. You talked about the difference between copy editing for a novel and copy editing for a comic book. We're gonna have some future episodes actually because we had Heather Antos on actually talking about comics. She'll be on the week after this one. But talk to us
ah,
about what some of the things you've noticed about copy editing a comic book. What strikes you the first?
well, there's a lot of use of bold for emphasis. There's all these sorts of things that if you did it in regular fiction, it looks amateurish. If you're reading a regular novel and suddenly someone is talking in all caps bold, it looks kind of silly. But that's the language of comic books. And there's lots of little fiddly things that go along with that. It's like do the double dashes that stand in for an M dash, are they in bold if they're after a bold word? And, there's just all these little things that are completely different from the details of prose. And so, it was a learning curve for me to start getting all those things. And there's still lots of stuff that I look up every time I'm going through a comic book because
Yeah.
it's not nailed down in my noggin as much as the Chicago Manual of Style is. And but I got a head start by copy editing that style guide
That's
by
cool.
Madeline beforehand. Uh, and so it's been fun. It's really sort of reinvigorated my love for the genre.
And
Because
would
I
you?
used to read a lot. Uh, I used to read a lot more comics when I was a kid, and I
Mhm.
drifted away from it. And then, over the years, I've primarily come back into comics because of Star Trek, picking up the Star Trek comic books here and there. But I even didn't, um, there's been stretches of years where I wasn't keeping up on the Star Trek comic books because there's just, so much stuff to keep up on. And and so when I dove back into this and started reading, all the Star Trek comic books as they were coming to me as a proofreader. Not to mention that within a few weeks of working on Star Trek comic books, IDW started sending me graphic novels, non-Star Trek graphic novels to proofread. And now they're also sending me some of the horror titles in their new IDW Dark imprint. And so I'm suddenly, reading a bunch of comic books every month and
Yeah.
sometimes graphic novels across a variety of genres. And it really has just brought me back to the love for the form, the stories you can tell, the melodrama that you
Yeah.
can get away with in a comic book that if you put it in a regular story might just seem like, well, that's a little bit too much.
Yeah, what's really amazed me too, and well, I know we're going to talk about a lot because we're going to have a lot of different comic writers come on the show this year. We have scheduled, but the economy of words, because you have art that you can change how you use words because of the economy of words, cutting as much down to raw, right, to save
Yeah,
space for that art.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And to proofread a 30-page comic book can take just like 45 minutes to an hour because the level of proofreading, the number of words and punctuation that you're proofreading, uh, you know, I don't know what the average word count is of a Star Trek comic book, but compared to a 30-page story, obviously it's just going to be a tiny fraction of the words. But there's also times where I will mention if I see something in the art. There might be something that I'll mention, hey, that color doesn't look quite right, or those sorts of things that might slip through the cracks, which might be slightly above the pay grade of the proofreader, but that's the kind of stuff that'll jump out at me as a longtime Star Trek fan because you're used to because you've seen all the shows, you know what the colors are supposed to be, what the uniforms are, what the bridge is, there's all those sort of details that are well established in the movies and TV series. And obviously, there's a certain amount of artistic license that is taken when you translate that into comic book art. But as we all know, Star Trek fans are very demanding about details. And so you have to keep an eye out on everything.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that. I remember when my son was little, I got him some of the Star Trek children's books. I'm not going to name the publisher because I don't want to embarrass them, but I was happily sitting there reading them to him, and I was like, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this artwork. And it was original series, and the sleeve braid was wrong, and in a couple of places they had the wrong arrowhead, the wrong delta on the uniform, and I couldn't see past it. I was like, oh no. Because I'm such a Star Trek fan, and I've been, immersed in it for decades. And it's like I saw the artwork, and it's one thing to have an artistic interpretation of it, but then it's another thing to have the details just wrong.
Yep.
So it's hard to
Yep.
turn that part of the brain off and just enjoy the story. Have you had an opportunity to do a lot of, I mean, like, has the art generally been, I mean, obviously I've been reading a lot of the comics, and Michael, I know you read a lot of the Trek comics too, and I don't think I can remember the last time I saw a egregious error in the artwork.
Oh no, no. I mean, in months I've been reading them, maybe once or twice I've made a comment about something that might be, improved or sharpened or something, but it's all been very minor fiddly stuff that
Nice.
I sometimes, I do this as a fiction editor as well. There are times where I will note something, I'll make a comment on something, but I will preface it by saying, I know that this is being very, very picky. But you might want to think about this. And lots of those times, if the author or the artist or whatever were to say, no, it's fine as is, I would say, sure, that's your call, no problem. But it's my job to mention anything that pops out at me,
Hmm.
but I know that sometimes I'm pickier than necessary.
Hmm. Fair. No, fair.
I know that I've probably made apologetic comments like that in people's Star Trek Adventures manuscripts.
Yeah, and I think 9 times out of 10, I take the comment and I massage the text and call it good. I mean I can't even think of an example where you had a comment and I was like, yeah, okay. Unless I was under a severe time crunch, like a few years back when we were just trying to get the books done and out the door. We've had a little bit more luxury recently because we're on a better schedule, but yeah, yeah. I mean, I think consistently your feedback's always valuable and excellent. So my next question then, Scott, is like given the three different mediums that you're working in, fiction, comic books, and RPGs, like is there one that you have a preference for? And if so, why?
Huh. I generally don't think of things in terms of, like ranking stuff like that.
Mhm.
If forced to choose, I would probably just say the novels because that's I've always wanted to be a writer, and so that's the medium that I work in myself.
Mhm.
And so I do have a certain uh, fondness and yeah, I can't think of the word I want to say um, for that medium. But I love working on anything Star Trek, for one thing. Um, and I take on some of these things like the game or the comic books partially out of the challenge too, to have the opportunity to work on something different and expand my knowledge and experience. And so, uh, even though the novel form is near and dear to me, I don't want to make it sound like I'm knocking on the gaming or the comic book media because that they all have their own charms.
Yeah. And you also, and as you mentioned before, in the case of the book you assisted, you work outside of Star Trek too. We don't want to cubbyhole Scott here.
Yeah.
I know I've had a pleasure of working him on other professional projects, and it's been really nice for your feedback. So with all this going on with Star Trek wise, are you still able to take on other non-Trek work?
Oh yes. None of my Trek work is voluminous enough
Okay.
to
Yeah.
to make a living from. And so I also edit books for Baen Books. That's a lot of military sci-fi, but also alternate timeline and fantasy novels. And then I do a lot of work directly for authors that are either going to self-publish or just want to get, an extra polish on their manuscript before they start trying to send it around, as you well know.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I work on a wide variety of stuff. Like right now, I've got a couple of indie author sci-fi novels that I'm copy editing, and I also am copy editing a uh, short story, couple of short stories that are Sherlock Holmes
Oh,
for
cool.
my friend Christopher Abbott. I've been working with him now for about 5 years. This is our 20th Sherlock Holmes book together.
Wow.
And in this one, he actually invited me to contribute a story, um, a Christmas themed story. And I never could have imagined writing a Christmas themed anything. But and he's been asking me to write a Sherlock Holmes story for him for a while.
Mhm.
And when he asked me to do, if I'd be interested in doing a Christmas themed one, I was just amazed. An idea just immediately popped into my head. And
Wow.
so I wrote a Christmas themed Sherlock Holmes. Actually, it's more like a novelette. It's pretty long. It's about 15,000 words. And that will be appearing in his next Christmas themed book. It's coming out Christmas Day.
Good. So
And
we really
so
want to
I've
emphasize that
got
you have a
that
yeah, you're not a
to work
one-trick
on.
pony. You have a lot of different things you can do. It's important to know that.
Well,
So
my
now,
first professional
uh-huh,
sale,
uh-huh.
my first professional sale was literary fiction. No genre elements, just a story about an elderly farming couple in Minnesota.
That's so
As
cool.
as far as you can get from anything else I've had published
All right. So now
as a
with that,
fiction
please.
writer.
Yeah, so please herald us into the 60th anniversary of Star Trek, though. You know, you've absorbed so much of it, to swing us back there. You've absorbed so much. And I gotta ask you, Scott, where do you hope it goes? Actually, before I even get there, how do you compare the energy now for Trek to maybe the energy 25, 20, 20 years ago with Trek? Where do you think we're at right now
Hmm.
with the franchise? What's your pulse on it?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of excitement that's generated by all the new shows. They bring in new fans. Because yeah, I remember like back when disco first started, seeing people post online, younger people that, you know, had never watched any Star Trek before, and they were being pulled in by this new, more contemporary storytelling. And so that's exciting. And obviously, there's been over the decades, there's been a lot of ups and downs for the franchise. There was that 10 years between the end of the original series and Star Trek the Motion Picture. And, so there's been these dry spells and then there's been resurgences. And I think we're definitely still in a period of resurgence now with the ever expanding variety of shows that Secret Hideout is producing. But there are still bumps in the road. There was, the JJ Trek continuity, which apparently they've decided that's over now, and there's a new movie that's in pre-production, apparently. I mean, it's hard to know how much to trust what leaks out to the press. Uh, so it's hard to imagine in some ways what's going to happen. I think that there will be, there'll be more movies, there'll be more TV series, there'll be more books, which I hope to be working on in some form or another. I don't know. I
Why do
don't
you
think,
still hit? Why do you think it still hits hard? Why, I mean, I know we're all biased here, but for you, why is it still hit hard? Star Trek is relevant.
well, there's two things. First, it is still relevant because it often tells stories that are relevant to today. That's been a touchstone for Star Trek and often science fiction in general, that you use these otherworldly stories to turn a lens on the human story and the good and bad things that people get up to. We examine them through the lens of fiction and science fiction and Star Trek. And so I think that Star Trek still hits those notes. But then you also have the very strong uh, aura of nostalgia. When you have a franchise that's been around for 60 years, you have the people that have been living with it all their lives, like myself, and I'm I'm ride or die for Star Trek. Is that the right term? I'm an old guy. I have to trying to keep up with
Yeah,
the things
that's a
people
good.
say.
You
You're
used it
fine.
correctly.
It's
You're
fine.
good.
Totally fine.
And you know, I'm always going to love Star Trek. I can't love every iteration or every episode to the same level, but that it spoke to me somehow when I was, in second grade and seeing the original series in reruns and then seeing the animated series as it first came out. And the hook was just set so deep, I'm just there for it. And I was there for it as a fan, and I'm still a fan. And now that I work on it in various forms, I'm just that much more deep into it. I just love this franchise, the characters, what it tries to say. And I think that these new series help to reinvent the franchise for whole new audiences. And I think that Star Trek Adventures can do that as well, that it can bring in people who play role-playing games that maybe haven't been Star Trek fans per se, but they're role-playing people and they try out a new game. And I think it can be the same thing through the comic books, that you have comic book fans that will give a try to the Star Trek comic books, even if they're not familiar with the original series or the new series. And so I think that the franchise as a whole is just going to keep chugging along. It's got a lot of inertia.
Agreed, agreed. I'm up on all the Star Trek Strange New Worlds and Discovery and Picard novels. I know you're working on some of them. Some that came out before your tenure, but the capturing of the voices and telling the stories in between the gaps of some of the shows has been totally, relevant. It's new, it's modern, it's a new voice to them. And seeing new characters like Lon or Ortegas, who are some of my favorites, represented,
Yeah.
or Rafi Musiker, it's new. It's totally different from the novels I read from 20 years ago. So hopefully people are stumbling on it as their new literature. And for those of us who can never get enough of the TV shows, novels and comics are the way to fill that need.
Yeah.
So Scott, I know we're slowly moving toward the end here, but I was curious, given how many different um, uh, ways Star Trek is in literature, right? You got novels, short stories, comic books, RPGs, film, screenplays, audio dramas. Since David Mack and had the radio drama recently with Khan. Is there a particular medium that you would like to work in, whether you're writing, editing, or whatever? Primarily for Star Trek, but since we're also trying to talk outside of Trek too, is there a particular literary or a literary adjacent medium that you haven't worked in yet that you would want to work in?
Boy, I don't know. I kind of, sometimes, now that I'm working on the comic books, I find myself wondering, could I develop a story that would work for a comic book? Um, and, I don't know. That's because that is a very focused storytelling, especially if it's like a one shot. Um, if it's a 5-issue miniseries, even so, that's some very focused storytelling. And and it's very much like writing a screenplay or something, is that you're relying on the visual to tell a lot of the story. And and so I would love to try my hand at writing a Star Trek comic book. um I did, as you know, try my hand at writing Star Trek Adventures role-playing mission with the Shackleton Expanse, and found that so difficult that I'm glad I did it. I'm very proud of what I accomplished with your help, but wow,
I
that is
played it. It was great. I loved it,
it.
just so you
It
know.
is. Oh, thank you. That is such a challenge and so far outside, because whether, I mean, any other format, book, comic book, whatever, when you're the writer, you tell the story beginning, middle, and end. You get to tell everything. And for role-playing games, when you're trying to just create this framework to allow the gamers to play their way through and find their own way, and come up with their own digressions, leaving those holes is so hard when you have a decades long experience writing stories and novellas and stuff, where you just tell the whole story. You're not thinking about the reader. You're not saying, I have to leave big holes in the story here for the reader to figure out on their own. Holes is not the right word to use, because that sounds like a derogatory term, but it's a framework. You're creating this framework that allows this space for the gamers to create their own, stuff in there. And that was just so counterintuitive for my old dog brain.
Yeah, no. For anyone who's played as six impossible things, was it six? As many as six impossible things, I think was what you wrote. I've heard a lot of good feedback about it, so I encourage you to experiment with comic writing too. It'll be an equal success, I'm sure. All right, good. All right, so this is a good point for gratitude, I think. Scott, I can't thank you enough. I know you've been on continuing conversations more time than I can count. What started for me and Jim as a little podcast we thought was only going to go 10 episodes ended up finding an amazing niche of writers and people who aspire to be writers who do that through game mastering and playing the game. And you've come on many times in support of us for many of our anniversary shows. And so I just felt it was so appropriate to have you come on to launch our entry into the 60th anniversary of Star Trek. Your body of work is incredible. It's, you know, your energy is really good. And I just really appreciate that. So my gratitude goes to you
Well, thanks.
for
Thanks so
supporting little
much.
guys like us. And really, you know, hope that we launch into an amazing 60th year. I have a feeling it's going to be pretty rambunctious and wonderful for Star Trek. So thank you for, again, being one of our constants on continuing conversations. Why don't we go to gratitude with Scott, and we'll close out with Jim.
I'm just gratitude. Boy, where do I start? I'll just say I'm grateful to the franchise. You know, I started as a fan and then was able to enter it professionally, and it keeps bringing me more opportunities to uh, develop new skills, meet amazing new people. The people I work with at IDW, like Heather Antos and Cassandra Jones, are just fabulous. And so my gratitude goes to all the Star Trek fans and all the people that work on Star Trek in all its myriad forms. It just brings so much enjoyment to people.
Yep, and not to parrot that too much, but I'm grateful to Star Trek as well. I mean, here we are celebrating the 60th anniversary, and to have started off life as a Star Trek fan and turned into a Star Trek super fan, and then to do some fiction writing, and then to be in a place where I can shepherd the RPG along to the next generations of fans, and also bring in new writers, right? New writers, new editors, etc. To have a piece of it, and to be able to bring so much joy to so many people through all the books that we make. I mean, Michael, you worked on Captain's Log, and you can see every day we get that immediate feedback from fans online, and you get that to some extent with comic books and fiction too, I'm sure, right? Because, like, you know, people will post reviews or they'll be on the message boards, and it's just great to see somebody take something that we've created in Star Trek and do something amazing with it and make their own Star Trek stories. And I think that for me is the biggest gift. So that's where my gratitude is, like you, Scott, is to everybody involved in this franchise over the last 60 years, making it what it is, and giving us the opportunity to add pieces to it and to continue to grow it. So big gratitude for everybody involved, including the fans. I mean, if there were no fans, then none of us would be doing this.
Dead on correct. Very good. All right. Well, we know the conversation continues. We have a lot going on in 2026. This is really just launching. We ask you all to tune in every week because I have to say, it keeps getting better, right, Jim? Every year we have the more amazing return guests, new guests coming on, and we are going to hit everything Star Trek literature, it seems, in 2026. So, Scott, we're definitely going to want to have you come back on to talk about some of the projects you're working on as you continue throughout the year. Thank you again. Everyone, IDIC.
Anytime.
Yeah. Live long and prosper, y'all. Be safe, be well. We'll see y'all next time.